Hi guys and welcome back to Is It Worth It Reviews. Today we are going to talk about Rose Technics RT5000 DAC that also has a headphone amp and headphone outputs. And this one is not only a beauty, but it cooks too. Rose Technics RT5000, as you can see, is like retro, vintage looking device, but for my personal taste, it's very beautiful. It has this wooden front and then black leather on top and also on the bottom of the unit, with black aluminum sides and back panel. There is also a green leather version, and that one reminded me a lot on Lebanon high-end products. Now this whole device is based around two Sabre DAC chips. I'll be putting the models on the screen, and connectivity is good. In the back you can see that we have three digital inputs: USB, optical and coaxial. And you choose SPDIF inputs or USB input by pulling this switch up or down. It's also retro, but it works. Then for analog outputs, we have single-ended RCAs and balanced XLRs. And if you noticed that there is something a little bit weird about the colors of RCAs or XLRs that are actually input jacks instead of output jacks, don't worry, this is only a pre-production unit sent out to reviewers. It will be fixed in the final retail unit. One thing to mention here is that these analog outputs on the back, RCA and XLR, are line outputs and they do not have variable volume control, so you cannot use this one as a small preamp unless you're taking your signal from the headphone output. By the way, we have three headphone outputs. Two are single-ended, 6.3 and 3.5 millimeters, and one is balanced, Pentacon 4.4 millimeters. And this is a truly differential design, with both sides of that differential design using op-amps, so the balanced has twice the power of the single-ended output, 1.6 watts compared to 800 milliwatts. That said, both are plenty powerful, both sound great. If you have the option, go for balanced output. If you don't, use single-ended, don't worry about it. But the useful thing that all of these outs have is 4 different gains that you can choose by pressing one button and you circle these 4 gains. The lowest gain is really low and only for the most sensitive in-ears that I can think of. And the highest one has really high gain, so I ended up using the middle two most of the time. But having these different gains is a good thing, because this is analog potentiometer that we are using here. And in its beginning, in the first few millimeters, there is a noticeable channel imbalance. And once you get to like 8 o'clock, you do not notice it anymore. But having different gains is good, because with really high sensitive headphones and in-ears, you do not have to use that section of the potentiometer that has that imbalance. Just choose lower gain and crank the volume up more. Then talking about some other features, you can select between 7 different digital filters. And you can also use Bluetooth connection with this one. And as you can see, there is no display on this device. Everything you need to do, you do using these buttons and looking at some LED notifications. And also there is no remote control. So this is quite, not only in terms of look, it has that vintage retro vibe, but in terms of how you control it and how it lacks some modern thingies. But once you actually start using it and you hear how it sounds, you quickly forget about all of that. For some reason, I was quite convinced that this is a headphone amp first, and that the DAC section will be like a second thought. I was not correct, by the way, but I thought it will be like that. So I started using this one as my desktop DAC and headphone amp. And I tried it with several different headphones and earphones, and I realized it sounds really good. Starting with tonal balance, it's mostly neutral, maybe slightly warmer and sweeter, but mostly neutral. It's highly revealing, detail retrieval is great, the sensation of spaciousness around me and separation of instruments is also great, but what surprised me the most is a sort of liquidy smooth tone. There is a tone coherence, that tone continuity in time that makes everything sounds liquidy smooth. And I didn't expect that from a device that doesn't use tubes anywhere in its path. But I wanted to check if I'm correct about that tonality, so I started comparing it and I quickly used Chord Mojo 2 and its headphone outputs, just to realize that Mojo 2 is not really a competition to Rose Technics RT5000. Now, don't get me wrong, Mojo 2 is a really great sounding device on its own, but compared to Rose Technics, it sounds dynamically flatter and spatially flatter. It doesn't have as much empty space and three-dimensionality around you. And it's just not as snappy, dynamic, and engaging and lively sounding as Rose Technics. RT5000 is clearly a tier above Chord Mojo 2. And Mojo 2 had a permanent decrease in its price recently, and I think now they're priced roughly the same, but still RT5000 sounds clearly better to my ears. So I moved to xDuoo xDuoo 5 Pro, which is a bigger device, and it comes at $750, I believe. And I used it in its factory default state with a Sabre DAC module and default op-amps. Because this one is modular, you can change it and upgrade it quite a bit, but I have to keep every review reasonably simple and short, so I used it in its factory default state. Now, xDuoo is more alive sounding, more dynamic sounded and fuller sounding than Chord Mojo 2. But still, it's not enough to fully match Rose Technics RT5000. It is close enough that I would call this xDuoo and this Rose Technics devices that are in the same tier. But that said, the Rose Technics does sound a bit more fuller bodied, more dynamic and lively and more engaging. xDuoo is just ever so slightly flatter sounding. So in its factory default mode, it is not exactly as good as RT5000, but if you use some better op-amps or maybe different DAC modules, there is a lot of potential in xDuoo. First, to completely close that gap and maybe even slightly surpass Rose Technics. But that said, xDuoo is more expensive to boot, and those upgrades would lift its price even higher. It's a great device, but Rose Technics here shows better value. Out of the box with its own power supply, it sounds slightly better. By the way, mentioning that power supply, Rose Technics uses 15 volts 3 amperes power supply. And since 15 volts is not that common, I didn't have any better, higher quality power supply to test it with. So all tests were done with its own wall wart that came in the box. No upgrading it whatsoever, which makes these results even more impressive. But that leads me to how does it actually sound if you use it as a DAC only, using its line outputs. And for that I connected it to my room setup, my speaker setup, and immediately I noticed that same quality that I just praised in the headphone section. It's very smooth, liquid smooth, very continuous, very coherent tonality. It's slightly bolder and juicier down below in the mid-bass and lower mid-range, and just ever so slightly tamer in highs. but not in a way that highs sound dull, because highs do have that sort of brilliance. Even if they're not really extended and really open and airy, they have that great brilliance that tubes usually have. And once again, clarity is great, detail retrieval is great, sound staging is very decent. We are not talking about some R2R levels of width and depth, but it's quite reasonably spacious sounding and uncluttered, and there is a good sense of three-dimensionality, and each tone has its body and it feels palpable and three-dimensional. And dynamics is also good. This deck sounds alive and snappy and positively forward when it needs to be, when the song and rhythm are engaging. And I immediately started comparing it. First, I used Topping D70 Pro Octo, which is priced exactly the same. And this is a standalone deck without any headphone amplifier inside. And I have to say that head-to-head, I did prefer Rose Technics RT5000. All of that boldness and liveliness and just coherence in the sound and even brilliance a little bit in highs, to me and to my ears sounds a little bit better than this Topping, which is once again roughly on the same level as RT5000, but it lacks just a little bit of that tone smoothness and liquidity. It's a little bit drier. And those differences are not big at all. They're subtle, but subtle they may be, they go in favor of Rose Technics RT5000. And they're priced the same. This one comes with a headphone output too, which is also great. The thing that might still recommend Topping D70 Pro Octo is that it has a display, it has a remote control, and it has a variable line outputs, which means you can control the volume using that remote, and this one can serve as a small preamp too. Then I moved to Geshelli Labs J2S, and out of the box, this one is more affordable, but it's a standalone deck, no headphone amplifier. Also out of the box, with TI op amps, with its own power supply, no upgrading whatsoever, it cannot compare to RT5000 in terms of how it sounds. Meaning that RT5000 sounds more spacious, cleaner, more three-dimensional, more engaging. This one is slightly closed in, a little bit muddier and less resolving. And I cannot go step by step because that would make this review insanely long, but once I fully upgrade J2S using Sparkos op amps, and instead of its own power supply, I used like moderately good hifi iPower X. That brings the total price to a slightly higher level, at least outside of the US, than RT5000. And it brings sonics of Geshelli to the same playing field with RT5000. We are talking about similarly full and smooth and liquid-like tonality, because Geshelli excels in that too. However, the RT5000 has even slightly fuller and juicier sounding mid-range and a little bit more of that brilliance in tones and highs in general. On the other hand, Geshelli here exhibits a bit more tone texture. Its highs are slightly more velvety sounding, not as brilliant as these on RT5000, but definitely more velvety and silky. And take, for example, one cymbal. It will sound a little more textured, and it will have just a touch more refinement through Geshelli Labs, and all of that refinement and texture will not be fully heard in the same way with RT5000, but that cymbal will have a bit more attack and a little bit more brilliance in its aftertone. So how I see it is that RT5000 in its default factory state is roughly matching what Geshelli Labs fully upgraded with better op-amp and better power supply. Well, you can go for even better op-amp and even better power supply, but even this configuration is slightly more expensive. And you can also get a better power supply for RT5000. Anyways, they're roughly equally matched, and RT5000 comes with a headphone amp as an extra, and arguably I would say that it looks and feels a little bit better out of the box with this wooden front and leather paneling. You can also have wooden casing for Geshelli, but that lifts the pricing even more. You get the gist. RT5000 is a great value. Then I moved to comparing it quickly to Topping D90 III Sabre, which is tonally more flat and more neutral. If you need to monitor and record a song, you would probably like Topping more because it resolves the tiniest details and transients better. It's grippier in the bass line. It's less sweet, but it's also a little bit drier sounding. And if I have to sum it up quickly, Topping here is more informative and more transparent, but it's also drier sounding. And I think that most of you would say that RT5000 has better musicality, better flow. But to cut the story short, if you need technical excellence, if you need neutrality, if you need monitor-like sound, Topping is slightly better sounding device. But if you just want to enjoy something that sounds beautifully, you could even argue that RT5000 sounds maybe a little bit more musical and has better flow and better brilliance. Is that just a pleasant coloring of the sound? Maybe, probably, I don't know, I cannot tell that, but it sounds mighty good. And my last comparison for today, SMSL SU-10. All said and done, out of the box, when you buy a product, this is probably the best sounding DAC below $1,000 that I've personally tested on this channel. And yes, it does sound a little bit richer, especially tonally richer, with better tone timbre and richer tone harmonics compared to RT5000 here. And it does have slightly bigger, wider sound stage. But it also has this slightly warmer and slightly softer kind of sound that some people like, some don't. But personally, I do prefer SU-10 here as a DAC. Once again, the difference is not huge. I try to pinpoint every difference for you, but the real difference, real life difference, especially in maybe not as resolving systems as my own is, it's more of a modest kind of difference. But that out of the way, I did prefer SU-10, which is more expensive, pricier at $900 standalone DAC without a headphone amplifier, which leads me to the conclusion. Rose Technics is a new name for me, and I believe for most of you, and this is their first entry to the market of DACs and headphone amps too, as I can see from their website. And I'm absolutely amazed that their first product sounds this good and this musical. It's not just something that measures well and it has plenty of details, but it's annoying on a longer listen. No, this is a seriously good sounding piece of hi-fi equipment. It can go head to head with any standalone DAC at $600, but once you count in this really good and quite powerful headphone amplifier on board, and really equally good basically headphone output as the DAC output is, I don't know any device at this price that sounds this good on all of its outputs. If it costed $900 I would still say it's a fantastic product. But at 600, it's just a steal considering how good it is in everything it does. And that will make it easy for me to recommend it and to ask you to use my links down below the video, which are affiliated. They will lead you to Hi-Fi Go. And if you decide to purchase this one, small percentage will go to me. But believe me, I'm a trustworthy guy. You can believe me. Even if those links were not affiliated, even if you can buy it on Hi-Fi Go, or you simply won't for any reason, no matter if I profit from that or not. This is a fantastic device that deserves your attention and potentially your money. And with that, it's time to end today's video. I hope you liked it and see you next time. Bye.